James had always believed his life was simple, quiet, uneventful, and safe. But when a mysterious box appears on his doorstep, everything changes. A woman with eyes that seem to hold centuries of secrets steps out, claiming that he is the key to her survival. As shadows from a forgotten past close in on them, James is thrust into a world where nothing is what it seems, and the stakes are higher than he could ever imagine. The truth? It's something far darker than he ever could have prepared for, and the hardest part? He's been a part of it all along. The rain fell steadily, its rhythmic tapping on the window pane a soothing backdrop to the cozy, dimly lit room. James sat on the edge of his worn leather couch, cradling a steaming mug of coffee in his hands. The glow of a single table lamp cast long shadows across the room, the kind of night where solitude felt like a welcome guest. He was used to the quiet, preferred it, in fact. Out here, in his old family home, surrounded by woods, interruptions were rare, but tonight was different. A sudden knock on the door shattered the stillness, echoing through the house like a challenge. James stiffened, his brow furrowing. He wasn't expecting anyone. In this weather, even the idea of a visitor seemed absurd. Slowly, he set the mug down on the coffee table and rose to his feet, his boots thudding softly against the hardwood floor as he approached the door. The knock came again, more insistent this time. He peered through the peephole, but the rain blurred his view. Swallowing his unease, he opened the door cautiously, the hinges groaning as if they, too, were wary of what lay beyond. Standing there, drenched in rain and cloaked in an almost tangible aura of mystery, was an old delivery man. His uniform looked like it had seen better days, and his face was partially obscured by the brim of his soaked cap. In his hands, he held a box, wooden, ancient-looking, and covered in carvings that seemed out of place in the modern world. "James Carter?" the man asked, his voice gravelly and low. James nodded, more out of reflex than understanding. "This belongs to you," the man said, thrusting the box toward him with surprising strength for someone so frail-looking. James hesitated, his hands hovering just shy of the box. "I didn't order anything." The delivery man tilted his head slightly, almost as if amused. "It's not about what you ordered, it's about what's been waiting for you." Before James could respond, the man turned abruptly and disappeared into the rain, his figure fading into the shadows as though he'd never been there at all. James stood frozen, the box now in his grasp, its weight heavier than he anticipated. For a moment, he considered calling out to the man, asking for answers, but the storm swallowed his voice before it left his throat. Closing the door behind him, James carried the box inside, his pulse quickening. He set it down on the dining table, its surface slick with rainwater. As he examined it, the details of the carvings came into sharper focus. They weren't random. These were intricate, deliberate patterns, almost like ancient symbols. A faint hum seemed to emanate from within, just at the edge of his hearing, making the hairs on his arms stand on end. A brass lock, old and tarnished, secured the lid. It had no keyhole, no visible mechanism to open it, as if it wasn't meant to be opened at all. James grabbed a towel and wiped the box dry, his mind racing with questions. Who sent this? Why did the delivery man seem so otherworldly, and what could possibly be inside? He shook his head, trying to dismiss the unease creeping over him. It was just a box. He'd dealt with worse in his life. He grabbed a crowbar from the toolshed and returned to the table, determined to force it open. As he positioned the crowbar against the edge of the lid, the hum grew louder, vibrating through the room. James paused, his instincts screaming at him to stop, but his curiosity overpowered his caution. With a grunt, he applied pressure. Nothing. The box seemed impervious, almost like it was resisting him. Frustrated, he tried again, but just as he did, a sharp click echoed through the room. He froze. The lock had opened on its own. James stared at the box, his chest rising and falling rapidly. The hum ceased, replaced by an eerie silence that felt far heavier than the storm outside. Slowly, he reached for the lid and lifted it. As the lid creaked open, the lights flickered, casting shifting shadows across the room. A faint whisper filled the air, indistinct but unmistakably real. James's hands trembled as he peered inside, the glow from within illuminating his face. What he saw made him stumble back, his breath caught in his throat. James stood frozen, his mind struggling to process what he had just seen, or rather, what he hadn't seen. The box's interior was impossibly dark, as if it absorbed the light around it. The faint hum had returned, but this time it felt deeper, resonating not just in his ears but in his chest, as though the box itself were alive. The whisper, soft, ethereal, lingered in the air like the ghost of a forgotten melody. He leaned closer, peering into the darkness within, half expecting something to leap out, but nothing moved, nothing changed. Swallowing his fear, James reached into the box. His fingertips brushed against something smooth and cold, sending a shiver racing up his spine. Whatever was inside felt unlike anything he had touched before. He pulled back his hand instinctively, his heart pounding like a war drum. "No," he muttered to himself, shaking his head as if to dispel the unease gnawing at him. "It's just a box, get a grip." Summoning his courage, he reached in again. This time, he gripped what felt like a hard, metallic object. As he lifted it out, the humming stopped abruptly, plunging the room into a silence so profound it felt suffocating. The object was a key, ornate and ancient, its surface edged with the same strange symbols that adorned the box. It was unlike any key James had ever seen. Its edges shimmered faintly in the dim light, as though it were made of something otherworldly. James examined it closely, his brow furrowed in thought. It didn't make sense. The box had no visible keyhole, no mechanism that required unlocking, yet here it was, a key that seemed to belong to the box but served no apparent purpose. He set the key down on the table, his gaze returning to the box. He tried lifting it, hoping to find some clue underneath, but the weight of it was staggering, far heavier than it had any right to be for its size. The carved symbols seemed to shift subtly as he moved it, an optical illusion that made his head spin. "This isn't normal," he whispered, his voice trembling. Determined to make sense of the mystery, James carried the box to his workshop in the basement. The space was cluttered with tools, gadgets, and half-finished projects, a haven for a man who preferred working with his hands to wrestling with his thoughts. Setting the box on his workbench, he grabbed a flashlight and inspected it more closely. The carvings seemed older now, more worn, as if they had aged decades in the span of minutes. "All right," he muttered, reaching for his crowbar again. "Let's see what you're hiding." He wedged the crowbar against the edge of the lid and pushed. The wood didn't budge. He applied more force, gritting his teeth, but it was like trying to pry open solid steel. Frustrated, he grabbed a hammer and struck the crowbar's handle. The clang echoed through the workshop, but the box remained intact. "Come on," James growled, his frustration boiling over. He swung the hammer directly at the box this time. The impact reverberated through the room, sending a sharp pain through his arm. He looked down, expecting to see a dent in the wood, but there wasn't even a scratch. The box was unyielding. James stepped back, wiping sweat from his brow. His breathing was ragged, his mind racing. This wasn't just any ordinary box. It was as if it were defying him, challenging him to figure it out. His eyes fell on the key. Could it be that simple? He hesitated for a moment, then picked it up. The key felt warm in his hand now, pulsing familiarly as though alive. He searched the box again for a keyhole but found none. Then, as if sensing his intent, the box emitted a faint glow. The carvings on its surface began to shift and align, forming a pattern that hadn't been there before. In the center of the lid, a small indentation appeared, a perfect fit for the key. James's breath caught in his throat. He hadn't seen the indentation moments ago. How had it appeared? Was the box responding to him? He placed the key into the slot, his hands trembling. The moment it clicked into place, a low rumble filled the room. The glow intensified, casting eerie shadows across the walls. James stepped back instinctively as the lid creaked open on its own, revealing the interior of the box for the first time. This time, there was no darkness. Instead, the box seemed to contain an entire galaxy, swirling lights, constellations, and nebulous clouds of color that defied description. James stared, awestruck, as the miniature cosmos pulsed with life. But his awe was short-lived. From the swirling depths emerged something unexpected, a voice, soft at first, but growing louder, clearer. "You weren't supposed to open it," the voice said, a mix of warning and sorrow. James stumbled backward, his heart racing. "Who's there? What is this?" The box began to tremble violently, the lights within flashing erratically. The voice spoke again, this time urgent. "Close it, before it's too late." James hesitated, his instincts screaming at him to obey, but his curiosity, a force stronger than his fear, kept him rooted in place. And then, from the heart of the swirling galaxy, something began to take shape, something human. James's breath hitched as the swirling lights in the box began to coalesce, folding and twisting into a distinct form. It was mesmerizing, otherworldly, yet deeply unsettling. The galaxy within the box dimmed, and for a brief moment, silence enveloped the room, a silence so profound it felt alive. Then, as if exhaling from its depths, the box revealed her. A young woman, curled up and motionless, appeared within the confines of the wooden structure. Her presence was both ethereal and startlingly real. She was dressed in vintage clothing, a faded ivory dress with lace accents, its fabric delicate and worn, as if it had survived an age far removed from the present. Her skin was pale, almost translucent, and her long hair fell in waves that seemed untouched by time. James stumbled back, his mind reeling. "What the?" he whispered, his voice barely audible. The woman lay perfectly still, as though she had been in a deep sleep. His eyes darted between her and the box, trying to reconcile the impossibility of what he was seeing. It made no sense. The box was too small to contain a person, yet here she was. The faint hum returned, softer now, emanating from both the box and the woman herself. James hesitated before stepping closer, his instincts torn between fear and concern. He knelt beside her and extended a trembling hand to check her pulse. Her skin was cold, almost unnaturally so, but he felt a faint, steady rhythm beneath his fingers. "She's alive," he murmured, more to himself than to anyone else. Before he could fully process this revelation, his eyes caught sight of something else within the box. A folded piece of parchment, weathered and fragile, lay beside the woman. Carefully, James retrieved it, his hands shaking as he unfolded it. The writing was elegant, flowing, but the ink had faded, making the words difficult to decipher. "To the one who opens this box," it began, "protect her at all costs. She is more than she appears." James's gaze flicked to the woman, his mind racing. What did this mean? Protect her from what, or from whom? The letter continued, "Beware of those who seek her. They will come. They will not stop until they have her, and once they do, the balance will be broken." A chill ran down his spine. What balance? What was she? His thoughts were interrupted by a faint gasp. The woman stirred, her body shivering as if she had just been pulled from icy waters. James dropped the letter and leaned in closer. Her eyes fluttered open, revealing irises of an unusual color, like liquid silver, reflecting the dim light of the workshop. "Hey," he said softly, unsure if she could hear him. "It's okay, you're safe." Her gaze locked onto his, a mix of confusion and fear clouding her expression. She opened her mouth to speak, but only a hoarse whisper emerged. Where am I?" "You're in my workshop," James replied, trying to keep his voice steady despite the chaos in his mind. I found you in this box. Do you remember anything? How you got here?" Her brow furrowed as she struggled to piece together her thoughts. After a long pause, she shook her head weakly. I don't know." James felt a pang of empathy as he watched her. She looked utterly lost, like a shipwreck survivor washed ashore with no memory of the storm. But there was something else in her eyes, something ancient, as though she carried the weight of countless lifetimes within her fragile frame. As he reached for a blanket to drape over her shoulders, she suddenly grabbed his wrist with surprising strength. Her grip sent a shock through him, and when she spoke again, her voice was steadier but filled with urgency. "Don't trust them," she said, her silver eyes wide with desperation. James froze. "Don't trust who? What are you talking about?" Before she could answer, the faint hum turned into a low, resonant rumble. The box, now empty, began to tremble violently on the workbench, its carvings glowing ominously. A sharp crack echoed through the room as one of the windows shattered, a gust of cold wind rushing in and extinguishing the lights. In the darkness, James heard her whisper one last thing: "They're coming!" The wind howled outside, rattling the windows of the workshop as James stood frozen, his wrist still in the young woman's grasp. Her fingers were cold, yet her touch burned with a strange urgency. Her silver eyes, wide and filled with something he couldn't quite understand, never left his face. "They're coming," she repeated, her voice barely more than a whisper, but there was a weight to it, like a warning carved into stone. "You have to believe me, James. You have no idea what you've just unleashed." James's breath caught in his throat. "How do you know my name?" Her grip tightened for just a moment before she let go, her expression turning to one of deep confusion, as though the question itself was an enigma to her. I don't remember much. It's all so foggy," she stammered, looking down at her hands as if seeing them for the first time. "But I know you. I've always known you." James recoiled slightly, his heart pounding in his chest. This didn't make sense. He had never met her before, he was certain of that. But something in the way she said it, in the quiet certainty in her voice, unsettled him. There was a truth behind her words, something he couldn't grasp, but that felt impossible to ignore. "Who are you?" he asked, trying to steady his voice. "What's going on? Why did they put you in that box?" The woman, still trembling, slowly pulled her knees to her chest, hugging them tightly as though seeking comfort. Her gaze was distant, lost in some unfathomable place between memory and oblivion. I don't know," she said softly, shaking her head. "I can't remember, but I think—" She stopped, her breath quickening. "I think they've erased me, erased everything, but I remember you, James. I remember us." A deep, hollow ache settled in James's chest at her words. He didn't understand. His mind raced through 1,000 possible explanations, each one more bizarre than the last, but none of them could account for what was happening right in front of him. The way she spoke, the way she looked at him, it felt like a puzzle with pieces that didn't belong together. "You know me?" "How?" he pressed, his voice rising in a mixture of frustration and confusion. The woman's lips trembled as she searched for the words, her eyes unfocused as if trying to break free from an invisible web. Then, almost to herself, she murmured, "I don't know where to begin. I was someone else before. I wasn't meant to be here, not like this. I was—" She paused, her breathing shallow. "I was locked away." James stepped forward, kneeling down beside her. "Locked away? By who?" Her eyes finally met his again, but now they were filled with a deep sorrow. "By them, by the ones who made the box, the ones who want me back." The words sent a chill through James, one that sunk deep into his bones. Made the box? What box? You're telling me there's more to this than just this? You're not making sense. But the woman was no longer listening. She was staring at the floor, her fingers trembling against the cold stone of the workshop. I remember, she whispered almost as if speaking to herself. I remember being someone important, but now it's all broken, scattered. She paused, her voice cracking. I remember a promise made long ago. James leaned in closer, sensing that she was on the verge of something crucial. A promise? What promise? What's going on here? Who are you really? Her head snapped up to look at him, and for the first time her eyes seemed to clear, focused. You're the key, James, she said, with an intensity that made his skin crawl. You always were. You were chosen to protect me. The words hit him like a physical blow, and for a moment he couldn't breathe. Chosen? This woman, whoever she was, seemed to think that he had a purpose in all of this. He wasn't some hero, some protector. He was just a man who liked to keep to himself, to hide away from the chaos of the world. This wasn't supposed to be his life. What do you mean I'm the key? He asked, his voice barely above a whisper. How could I? How could I protect you? I don't even know who you are. The woman closed her eyes for a moment, a single tear slipping down her cheek. You will remember, James, she said, her voice soft but sure. You need to trust me. This is bigger than both of us. I was kept inside that box for a reason. She wiped her tear away, her gaze becoming distant once more. I was never meant to stay hidden. The ones who locked me away, they knew what I was capable of, what I could do, but now they'll come for me, and when they do, you'll have to make a choice. Her words hung in the air like an unanswered question, and the silence that followed was suffocating. James's mind raced. He had no idea what he was dealing with, but he couldn't shake the feeling that somehow he was caught in the middle of something ancient, something powerful, and something he couldn't outrun. The woman's voice broke through his thoughts again. You'll remember who I am soon enough, James, and when you do, you'll understand why you're the only one who can stop them. James stared at her, his heart pounding. The weight of her words pressed down on him like a storm ready to break, and in that moment the first spark of dread flickered in his chest. The storm outside had escalated, the wind howling like a living thing, rattling the walls of the workshop. James paced back and forth, his thoughts in a whirlwind. The young woman who, despite her confusion and fragmented memories, had just claimed he was chosen to protect her, was sitting on the bench, her eyes distant and hollow, as though still lost in the tangle of her forgotten past. What did you mean, they'll come for you? James asked, trying to keep his voice steady, but it trembled with uncertainty. Who's coming? And what do you mean by... Suddenly, a loud bang echoed from the front door, snapping him out of his spiraling thoughts. His heart skipped a beat. The door wasn't just knocking, it was pounding, as if someone or something was desperate to get in. The sound was so forceful that it rattled the windows and sent a shiver down James's spine. The woman's head snapped up, her silvery eyes flashing with sudden recognition. "They're here," she whispered urgently, her voice filled with an edge of panic. "You need to hide me, now." James's blood ran cold. Who's here? His heart was pounding now, an overwhelming sense of dread filling the space between his ribs. She stood up quickly, but her movements were jerky, as if she was fighting against some invisible force pulling at her. "They know where I am, they can sense me, even through the veil." James glanced at the door, then back at her. Her words made no sense, but her eyes, those eyes, told him that she wasn't lying. She was afraid. And for the first time since she had appeared in the box, James realized just how deep the situation ran. She wasn't just an innocent woman lost in time, she was something more. There was another sharp bang on the door. This time it was followed by a series of strange, raspy voices, low, guttural, as if they were speaking in unison. "Let us in," the voices rasped. It sounded like a chant, a command, and it chilled him to his core. James's gaze snapped back to the woman. Her face was pale, her mouth dry, as she looked around frantically. "Please, James, you don't understand. They—" Before she could finish, a shadow shifted just beyond the windows, moving with unnatural speed. James's eyes darted to the pane, but he could see nothing through the rain and the darkness outside. The banging on the door grew louder, and this time the door frame began to creak under the pressure. The woman grabbed his arm, her fingers cold, digging into his skin. "They won't stop until they find me. You don't have much time. You have to trust me." "Who are they?" James demanded, his pulse racing. "What do they want?" But her response was interrupted by another deafening crash, and this time the door didn't just shake, it splintered. A jagged crack ran through the wood, and with a groan the door collapsed inward, its pieces flying across the room. The light in the workshop flickered, then went out completely. James barely had time to react. In the pitch darkness, figures, tall, cloaked, and moving with disturbing synchronicity, stepped into the room. Their presence was oppressive, suffocating, and the cold air thickened with an unnatural heaviness. The faint scent of decay lingered in the air as they approached, their movements silent, deliberate. James's breath caught in his throat as he recognized something about them, something familiar, but he couldn't place it. The figures were human in shape, but there were no faces, only smooth, featureless masks. Their eyes were glowing faintly red, like burning embers, giving off an eerie, predatory light. The woman gasped. "No," she whispered, her voice cracking with raw terror. The tallest of the figures stepped forward, its head tilting slightly as if studying James. The others remained still, standing like shadows, waiting. "She is ours," the leader said, his voice cold and hollow, as though it wasn't coming from his mouth, but from deep within the walls themselves. "You cannot protect her, she belongs to us." James's heart hammered in his chest. The words hit him like a freight train, but something about the way the figure spoke, there was a deep, unnerving certainty in his voice. This was no ordinary threat. The woman stepped between James and the cloaked figures, her face twisted in determination, her hands raised. "I will not go back to you," she hissed, her voice shaking with defiance. "You will never have me again." For a moment, the room was still. The figures remained silent, observing her, their glowing eyes piercing the darkness. James could see her trembling, but there was a fire in her that hadn't been there before. The fear that had consumed her moments ago had shifted into something else, something fierce, primal. Then, with a swift movement, the leader raised a hand, and the room seemed to shift, the air growing even colder, as if the very atmosphere had thickened. "You cannot escape what is fated." The woman's eyes locked onto his, and for a heartbeat, everything went deadly still. A low hum filled the room, vibrating the very walls, the floor beneath their feet. The cloaked figures took a step forward in unison, their movements synchronized, their hands reaching for her. But before they could take another step, the woman raised her hand, and a burst of white-hot energy erupted from her, forcing the figures back. They staggered, their cloaks billowing in the sudden gust of power, but they didn't fall. Instead, they regrouped, as if the blast hadn't phased them at all. The woman's breath came in short, ragged gasps as she staggered backward, her body trembling with exertion. "They're not human," she gasped. "They're not even alive." James's mind raced, but he couldn't afford to think. He had to act. He grabbed her arm, pulling her back toward the far corner of the workshop. "We need to get out of here," he shouted. But the cloaked figures were already closing in again. The air in the workshop was thick with tension, the only sound the frantic rhythm of James's breath and the soft crackle of the energy still swirling around the woman. She was shaking, her silver eyes wild with panic, but there was something more in her gaze now, something like resolve. "They won't stop," she whispered urgently, her voice hoarse. "If we don't get out now, it will be too late." James didn't need to be told twice. Without thinking, he grabbed her arm and pulled her toward the back door. The cloaked figures were advancing again, their steps slow but sure, as if they were in no hurry to catch them. The atmosphere grew colder with every passing second, a suffocating heaviness that pressed in on him like a physical weight. The back door. James reached it in 2 long strides, his heart hammering in his chest. With trembling hands, he yanked the handle, but the door refused to budge. "Damn it," he muttered under his breath, trying again, harder this time. The sound of the figure's hollow footsteps grew louder, like the ticking of a clock, counting down to some inevitable end. "They're almost here," the woman said, her voice rising with fear. "You have to—" Before she could finish, the door flew open with a deafening crash, revealing a shadowed alleyway outside. A rush of cold air hit James's face, biting at his skin. Without another thought, he yanked the woman through the door, slamming it behind them. The alley was narrow, lined with overgrown ivy and crumbling brick walls. The path ahead was shrouded in darkness, but there was no time to hesitate. "Run!" James shouted, not waiting for her response. They bolted down the alley, their footsteps echoing off the walls. The woman, despite her weakened state, moved with surprising speed, her feet barely touching the ground as she kept pace with him. The sound of the cloaked figure's footsteps followed them, rhythmic and insistent, like the pulse of some dark, predatory force. James glanced over his shoulder for a moment, just in time to see the shadows stretch unnaturally long down the alley. The cloaked figures were gaining on them, moving faster now. Their glowing eyes seemed to burn brighter, casting an eerie light on the cobblestones beneath their feet. "Where are we going?" the woman gasped, her voice strained. "I don't know," James shouted back, his breath coming in short bursts. "Just keep running." They turned a sharp corner, rushing down another alleyway. The city was silent at this hour, too silent. Every creak of the old buildings, every rustle in the wind, felt like it was part of the chase, like the very world was conspiring to trap them. The woman's breathing was ragged, but she didn't falter. Every now and then she glanced back, her eyes wide with fear. "They're too close," she murmured. "You don't understand. They'll never stop until they have me." James felt the urgency of her words deep in his bones. This wasn't just a chase, it was a hunt, and they were the prey. He could feel the figures drawing closer, their unnatural presence nearly suffocating. The air felt alive with their malice. "We have to hide," the woman cried, desperation in her voice now. They reached the end of the alley, and James skidded to a halt, his eyes scanning the area. The street ahead was deserted, but beyond that he could see the edge of the park, dark and vast, a patch of shadows among the dark city. It was their only hope. "Over there," he yelled, pointing toward the park. Without waiting for her to respond, he pulled her toward the opening, slipping into the darkness beyond the streetlights. As they sprinted through the park, the sounds of the figures' pursuit grew louder, their footfalls eerily synchronized. James's legs burned, his mind spinning. The park was vast, filled with twisting paths and hidden corners, but it was no sanctuary. The figures would find them. They always did. The woman stumbled slightly, and James grabbed her arm to steady her. "We can't stop," he urged. But just as they neared a thick cluster of trees, the sound of the figure's footsteps stopped, dead silent. James froze, his eyes darting to the shadows around them. The park was so quiet now it felt unnatural, as if the world itself had gone still. "Where are they?" he whispered, his voice tense. The woman's silver eyes scanned the darkness, a flicker of panic crossing her face. "They're close, too close." Suddenly, a voice, low and unsettling, echoed through the trees. You cannot outrun fate, little ones. James's blood ran cold. He whipped around, but the alleyway was empty. They were alone, or so it seemed. Then, from the darkness ahead, a shape emerged, followed by another. The figures had surrounded them. In that instant, James understood. The chase was over. The figures closed in around them, their glowing red eyes piercing the darkness like twin beacons of doom. James's pulse raced, his heart hammering in his chest, but no matter how fast he tried to think, no escapes seemed possible. The park, once a place of refuge, now felt like a cage, its shadows stretching and twisting into monstrous forms. The woman, still trembling, stood beside him. Her breath was shallow, her gaze flickering from one figure to the next. There was no panic in her eyes anymore, only a deep, almost sorrowful acceptance. "We don't have much time," she whispered, her voice steady despite the terror closing in on them. "It's time for you to know the truth." James swallowed hard, his mind reeling. "The truth? What truth?" he demanded, trying to keep his voice calm despite the overwhelming fear. "You said you knew me. You said I was chosen. Chosen for what, exactly? What is all of this?" The cloaked figures stood silently now, not moving but watching, waiting. The leader, the tallest one, stepped forward, his face still a smooth, featureless mask, his voice like a dark echo of fate itself. "She cannot hide from her destiny any longer, nor can you, James." James felt a shiver run through him. The words felt like a spell, heavy with something far older and darker than he could comprehend. Before he could respond, the woman raised her hand, and a ripple of energy pulsed through the air, momentarily pushing the figures back. She staggered as if the effort drained her, but there was no hesitation in her eyes. She turned to James, her expression softer now, tinged with something like regret. "You were never just an ordinary man, James. You were always meant to find me." Her voice trembled, but there was an undeniable power behind it. "You and I, our paths have been intertwined for centuries. You were the key, the protector, the one who would stop them." James's mind spun. "Stop who? What are you talking about?" His voice was hoarse, his confusion growing with each word. The woman's eyes grew distant, as if she were recalling a forgotten dream. "I was once a guardian, just like you, but I was betrayed. I was sealed away in that box, hidden from time, from the world, so that they could rewrite history. They've always been searching for me, for the power I once held. They knew that when the time was right, you would come for me." The pieces of the puzzle began to shift, slowly clicking together in James's mind. She wasn't just some lost soul, she had been part of something ancient, something far beyond anything he could have imagined. She had been protected, and now, he realized, it was his turn to do the protecting. The leader of the figures took another step forward. "She speaks of the past, of a power that cannot be undone. You may think you can save her, but you cannot. She belongs to us. She always has." James stepped forward, his fists clenched, a new resolve rising in him. "Number, I don't know what you are, but I won't let you take her." The woman reached out and grasped his hand, her touch warm, despite the cold dread in the air. "You don't have to stop them, James. You just have to help me remember." James looked down at her, his heart aching with a sense of connection he couldn't fully explain. Remember what?" The woman's gaze softened. "The power inside me, the power to break their hold." She met his eyes, and in that moment, James understood. She was the key, not just to her freedom, but to the destruction of the cloaked figures who hunted her. With a deep breath, the woman closed her eyes, and James felt the ground beneath them tremble. A flash of white light erupted from her, so bright that it blinded him. For a split second, everything went silent, the darkness lifting like a fog. When the light faded, the cloaked figures were gone. The air was still heavy with the after effects of the surge of power. The woman, though exhausted, stood tall, her silver eyes no longer filled with fear, but with something far more powerful, determination. "It's over," she said softly, her voice echoing with an ancient resonance. "They are gone." James took a tentative step forward. "What now? What happens to you, to me?" She smiled faintly. "Now you remember, you were never just a man in a workshop, James. You were a guardian, a protector of something far greater than you could understand. You were always meant to protect me, but I was the one who had to unlock your memories. You were the key, just as I was the key to your past." James's mind reeled, the weight of the revelation settling around him like a cloak of destiny. He had always thought his life was ordinary, that he was just a man with simple goals. But now he knew the truth. His connection to her wasn't just chance, it was fate. The woman stepped closer, her energy fading, but her presence still overwhelming. "I'll be safe now, but you will remember who you were, and you will remember what you're capable of. What would you do if you suddenly found out your life was part of a larger ancient mystery? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. If you enjoyed this twist-filled story, don't forget to like the video and subscribe to the channel for more thrilling tales.